We continue with the broadcast on news and views this morning and taking a look at our neighbors. We're looking at Zimbabwe, looking at the Zimbabwean elections. And this morning we are focusing on a former cabinet minister, Saviour Kasukuwere. And he's actually been barred from being an independent presidential candidate. And to unpack this, we are joined by renowned Zimbabwean anti-sanctions activist Rutendo Matinyarare. Rutendo, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Good morning to you too.
Yes, interesting developments, and I'm sure that your eyes are on Zimbabwe and the elections that are playing out, and just looking at people, personalities, candidates, and this latest development that has played out, the Zimbabwean High Court barring this independent presidential candidate and former cabinet minister from contesting the elections.
Yeah, and a lot of us are very surprised that Saviour Kasukuwere, having been a member of ZANU-PF, having him being in government for quite a long time, was clumsy enough to forget some of the rules of what it is that it takes to be a presidential candidate. He knew for a fact that he had to be in the country for at least 18 months, or as a permanent resident in the country for at least 18 months. He also knew that he had to be registered to vote, and for him to be registered to vote meant that he had to be in the country for the period of 18 months on a permanent basis, not as a visitor, and not as a person that is a sojourner or living in another country or a permanent resident of another country. And that is exactly what happened. So he contravened Section 91 of the Constitution, and that was Part C of that, where he hasn't been in the country for more than 18 months. So therefore, he has been taken off the register, the register of voters list. And so that automatically bars him from participating in the presidential election, because the presidential candidate must be registered to vote and must have been in the country on a continuous basis for 18 months.
Yes. Now, we know he's been in self imposed exile, and as you pointed out, 18 months out of the country. How relevant is this that, someone of his stature and his background has been actually barred from contesting the elections?
I never thought he was presidential material in the first place, because part and parcel of why Robert Mugabe lost popularity was because of people like him. He formed the what was called the G40 cabal. The G40 cabal were these people that surrounded the president and were friends of the president's wife. They were the same people that were perceived to have been influencing Grace Mugabe to take over power, or to so-called inherit the power from her husband, just because she was married to the president. And this is what made Robert Mugabe lose his popularity. People loved Mugabe. People believed in Mugabe. People believed in his leadership. But as he got older, we saw Grace Mugabe and this G40 cabal begin to take the reins of ruling the country. And to some extent, many people say that it was Grace Mugabe and people like Kasukuwere, who was a senior member of this G40 cabal, that were running the country. And at the time that they were running the country, there was less care for Zimbabweans and more focus on their individual accumulation, their family accumulation. And that's why Robert Mugabe lost popularity. They started getting people from the army, people like Emerson Mnangagwa, arrested and removed from ZANU-PF. And that's what made Mugabe lose popularity. And we put it squarely on the door of people like Kasukuwere, who had ambitions and were believed to have been using Grace Mugabe to usurp power, so that they themselves could eventually take power from her and then, be the leaders of the country. So we look at Kasukuwere as somebody underhanded. We look at him as somebody selfish. We look at him as somebody lacking in strategy. Hence, at the end of the day, Mnangagwa and his so-called Lacoste faction ended up taking over and ended up ruling the country. But when they took over, they forced Robert Mugabe to resign on the pretext that they wanted to eliminate the criminals around the president. And guess who the criminals around the president were? It's people like Kasukuwere, people like Grace Mugabe, and the other members of the gang.
It's amazing how, from what you've described, and how people actually try to make a comeback and get into the political game and the political arena. But as things stand right now, and in the build-up to the elections, it does appear that there is going to be just a two-horse race in this election.
Yes, it is. For us, we also still see the elections as unfortunate, They're unfortunate because they're a farce, they're a pretense. The government of Zimbabwe is under pressure to remain legitimate by having elections, but we all know that there are economic sanctions, coercive measures on the people of Zimbabwe. Every single citizen of Zimbabwe is under punishment. And the punishment that they're going under with these sanctions is to force them to vote for anybody other than the ZANU-PF. What it means is that, according to the Zidera purpose statement, or their policy position, is they say that they're going to impose Zidera sanctions on Zimbabweans because they want to assist Zimbabweans to achieve democratic change. Now, we ask, if Americans want democracy in Zimbabwe, why are they only imposing sanctions to bring change? What if Zimbabweans democratically want to maintain the current government? Well, what the sanctions are doing is that they deprive people water, healthcare, education, food, work. They even kill people by depriving them medicines and emergency services to force them to vote for the opposition. Now, a guy called Boyce Park, who is a professor at the New Jersey University, well, he was a professor at the New Jersey University in 2018, when he did a study on the impact of sanctions on incumbent governments versus the opposition. And he came up with the conclusion that sanctions have always, in 58 incidences where sanctions were utilized in elections, they actually affected the incumbent government in favor of the opposition. He then gives an example and a case study in his study about MDC, which is now the CCC, saying that they were able to get 42% of the vote in 2002 presidential elections because of the sanctions that had been imposed in 2001. And so it's under that environment of persecution by sanctions, which is a crime against humanity, which has been denounced by the United Nations, that Zimbabweans go to elections. And they go to elections being deprived of healthcare, food. Their government is being hindered from offering services so that people can vote against it. We believe those are rigged elections, number one. We believe a crime against humanity is being committed by the opposition, utilizing its friends in the West to persecute Zimbabweans, to force them to vote for them. And if Zimbabweans don't vote for them, then the sanctions continue for the past 22 years. People have been persecuted while going to the polls. We believe this is not fair. It's no different from people using AK-47s, rape, murders, killings, beatings, to force people to vote for a certain political party. But the government of Zimbabwe continues to say, let's have the election so that people don't believe that we are illegitimate, so that the West don't say that we're a dictatorship. But I believe that this is an unfair condition. Fikile Mbalula has brought it up a number of times, that in Zimbabwe we're having a problem where people are being persecuted, they are being displaced as refugees, and they're being forced to come into South Africa. And with that, the suffering that's in Zimbabwe that causes people to be displaced is the coercion behind who people should vote for, which is unfortunate. But fortunately, even under those conditions, ZANU-PF has still continued to get a 2/3 majority, which they got in 2018, which was extended with the by-elections that happened over the past 2 years. So they've got a super majority, and many people believe that they're going to maintain the super majority. The competition will be on the presidential election, but they still believe that Emmerson Mnangagwa will win.
Yes, and clearly, from what you are saying, giving legitimacy to this election and its outcome under extreme circumstances, under the most abnormal circumstances ever, and this alone is problematic. But sadly, Rutendo, the entire world and the outside world does not look at it that way. And for them, it has been an outcome. It's an election, and it's a question of who's won and who's lost. But all these other underlying issues, the sanctions you speak of, and also all the other problems that the country has faced over a period of time, really, those have not been addressed at all.
You see, the problem with what the public thinks is that the public is also allowed Iraq to be invaded on the pretext that it had weapons of mass destruction by an illegitimate government. The Americans are not a legitimate government. They're a government that is colonizing American Indian land. They have persecuted, killed, and eliminated American Indians. They're as illegitimate as the Australians and the Canadians, who continue to establish their countries on colonial basis. Now, these are the peoples whose opinions tend to be said to be international opinion, and their opinions are not necessarily fair, especially when they have become the jury and judge that are imposing these illegal sanctions, that are imposing these illegal measures, that are imposing this crime against humanity. So the question is, who believes that Zimbabwean elections are free, fair, and just? I don't think many people believe that. But we are left with having to have these elections all the time. Now, the question that you must ask yourself is this. Let's say, for instance, Nelson Chamisa was to win these elections. Do we believe that the Zimbabwean army will be able to salute a man that imposed sanctions on them, because there are direct sanctions on the military of Zimbabwe, there are direct sanctions on the government of Zimbabwe? Will the military salute a president that went to foreign powers to ask those foreign powers to invade his country by economic sanctions that are illegal even according to the Geneva Convention, which allows people to fight each other with weapons but disallows the use of sanctions embargoes? So we need to question that. I don't see the military of Zimbabwe saluting Nelson Chamisa. So the question is, if they won't salute Nelson Chamisa, if he's been given an illegitimate advantage and a criminal advantage by the sanctions, then how do they counter? They always will find a way to counter him. Now, if there's going to be counters and if there's going to be attacks and there's going to be reactions to those attacks, are we having a free and fair election? Is it even worth having this election? Or should SADC begin to sit down and question who should be contesting elections in Zimbabwe? Now, let me give you an example. Here in South Africa, you had Blackland First. Blackland First was supposed to contest in elections in 2019, and they refused to have white people in their party. They were disqualified by the IEC from participating in those elections. So why can't we stop an opposition that utilizes illegitimate crimes against humanity to force people to vote for them from participating? Why do we leave them if Blackland First can be removed just because they don't want other races in their party? This is the question we keep asking the government of Zimbabwe, because it's a waste of time for people to go to the polls when the polls are going to be rigged and counter-rigged and so forth and so on. It's problematic for me, and it actually creates a potential for instability in the region, because you're going to have these elections where even if the opposition were to win by cheating, the government would not accept that, and we as citizens would not accept that, and the likely chance of a civil war happening when that happens is very high, even a coup with the military refusing to accept the opposition. And
And
lastly,
just
you must also remember that with ZANU-PF generally getting super majorities, it's very likely that they're going to get a very high a share of the seats in parliament, because already MDC has lost, or CCC has lost a number of seats just because they did not meet up with the procedural requirements. So what's going to happen when Nelson Chamisa potentially, let's say he wins the presidency and goes into a parliament that is two-thirds his opponents? He's not going to be able to govern, because immediately they're going to have a vote of no confidence on the basis of the sanctions and him calling for the sanctions. And then what happens next?
exactly. But also, I think just finally, as a parting shot, looking at Africa in general, and you mentioned the American government, the Australians. These are illegitimate governments, and they have been. And these are colonizers. They've colonized. In fact, when you look at the British as well, the involvement in Zimbabwe, and looking at African solutions for African problems. And at this point in time, one of the biggest problems that we in Africa, and I'm sure Zimbabwe also face, is trying to implement solutions that are coming through from the outside world, from the likes of America, from the likes of Europe. And we have not been given the freedom to find solutions to our very own problems. And I suppose, when it comes to election time, and not only in Zimbabwe, but right across Africa, we've seen this type of, of scenario playing out each and every time there is an election in many African countries.
Well, the whole concept of having a popularity contest where the voting is done by usually very illiterate people who form the majority of any country generally in Africa because of low levels of education, low levels of literacy, influence of the media that comes from outside the country. So Zimbabwe is highly influenced by the racist South African media. How are you going to have a popularity contest under those circumstances? I don't think that it is fair. I don't think Africans should be following that system, because it doesn't work. Because even in the West, They say that they play democracy. They say that people vote for who it is that they want to lead them. But the truth of the matter is, you only vote for those people that were put in front of you, people who can afford the media to be able to campaign, people who are usually from the elite and not the common person. So people don't elect the leaders they want. They are actually given the leaders that they must vote for. These people are actually imposed on them by money, by finances, by people that are going to support them to be able to campaign. Is that democracy? I don't believe that is democracy. I believe it's a popularity contest of elites that are put in front of us, then forced upon us. So our question is, what is Africa doing participating in such an illegitimate process that doesn't allow us to choose the best man, but allows us to choose the most popular man? It is illegitimate. African governments should have left this a long time ago. We also find ourselves in 5-year cycles of elections where our governments go and spend disproportionate amounts of monies that could have been used to build roads, clinics, hospitals. We use them in campaigning. We use multi-million dollars in US dollar terms to get campaign material, to go onto these rallies, to go into constituencies. That money is wasted every 5 years. It polarizes the nation. We have oppositions that are funded by the West, and the West can only participate in destabilizing our people. The people like the Oppenheimers, the Brentest Foundation, people like Soros are meddling in our governments by these contestations that happen every single 5 years and divide our nation. If we eliminated this, there wouldn't be a CCC getting funded by the West. If we eliminated this, we wouldn't have the Brentest Foundation trying to influence who is leader in Africa so that they can get access to our minerals like they've done in Zambia. They put a puppet, they put their money for the puppet to come in. Now that puppet is selling Zambian assets to the Oppenheimers and mining companies from the West, and Zambians are highly indebted and impoverished. They're a highly indebted, poor country because of these elections and always changing leaders occasionally and cyclically. In South Africa, we run the risk right now of having the DA coming back. This apartheid-esque party is prone to come back into South Africa to become and to reinstitute the apartheid that they're reinstituting in the Western Cape, and potentially causing us to go back into a Cold War and maybe hot wars like we had in the 90s because of the apartheid government and its destabilization of Southern Africa. That is a threat to the entire region because we cannot be having the apartheid monsters coming back into power. But because we're having a popularity contest in a country where the media is driven by the apartheid system, you are going to see the DA probably sitting in a coalition with the ANC or other parties, and that is a huge
Well,
threat.
we definitely, obviously, will follow developments with the elections next year, but then I'm sure we will be calling on you as well from time to time, Rutendo. But for now, thank you for your time, making time out this morning, talking to us right here on Salam Media.
Thank you so much.
Rutendo Matinyarare with us this morning. And with that, we're going to go for a break. Next up, we've got Zinat Adam standing by. We're looking at the about turn on the part of Rajab Erdogan with regard to Turkey and Sweden's NATO membership.